This is amazing what you're pointing out, because I think it's important also to point out in these times, gods are usually attached to the land. So when you're not in that land anymore, it doesn't take too long usually, unless you start to, like you talk about, there's a reform, so to speak, in the Jewish communities on bringing God out there. Now, prayers, it's not required that you have to be at this temple, or, they have a change starts to take place. But my question, to be point blank, right? Because this is, I know it's not a yes or no all the time. That's how amazing history really is. But on the text, they think they're really there. In reality, they assimilate to a point where we have no reason to say in the first century there are authentic northern diaspora tribes floating around in Rome. This addresses a complex issue that the groups that I usually talk to, they think the Athenians and the Parthians and the various pagans, and they don't even like that word because they say that word's Latin, and that, and Gentile doesn't mean, it gives no ethnicity to it. So maybe we can delve into like a little bit of New Testament, if you don't mind. Are you cool with that?
That's fine. I mean, this ultimately does have a lot of bearing on that question. I mean, that's a big part of what, what's going to motivate people to want to look at this stuff to begin with, right?
Well,
so yeah.
How would you tackle that? Because to be point blank, I guess northern diaspora Israelites, they might have held out for some time, but in history they were lost to it. They were never lost to it ultimately, because the myth is more powerful than technically the reality, which is why they came up with they're across the river and they're on the other side of the mountain. They're out there. They're going to come back. God's going to be faithful. And you do this with Paul by showing, well, he was faithful. By Paul's pointing out what he's doing here is he's ensuring that the prophecies are being fulfilled. And, I see Paul as a very imminent, expecting something to happen soon. So he's trying that apocalyptic, timetable, so to speak, in his head is any moment now. So we're wrapping up prophecies, but I'm jumping ahead here. So I'm putting words in your mouth that I don't want to put. I want you to set the record straight from the research that you've done. Were there lost Israelites actually in the Roman Empire that weren't Jews?
So there were Israelites, or there were people who claimed to be Israelites who are not Jews. We know this because they identify themselves. So there's this really interesting, it's from just before the Roman period, but there's this interesting inscription that was found on Delos that refers to the Israelites who worship at Mount Gerizim. So it's a way of referring to themselves. They refer to themselves as Israelites, not Jews, and they specifically identify that we are the Israelites who worship at Har Gerizim, right, or who worship the god at Har Gerizim. So they're not a Jewish group. They claim to be Israelites, but they're Samaritans, right? So you do have Samaritans that are present in places in addition to just the region of Samaria in the Roman Empire. And that makes sense because you have a continued community of people who identify as Israelites at Samaria. You're going to expect that not all of them are going to all live there. You're going to have relations with other peoples and all of these other things. So that's not surprising. And, you have some evidence of that. Aside from that, there's zero evidence that anybody else across not just the Roman Empire, but across the world at that point would have understood themselves to be Israelites that were not Jewish. Now, what we do see is, and you mentioned this a little bit, is within Jewish texts, within in particular these apocalyptically focused texts, essentially as the world of contact expands, the horizon expands with it to where the Israelites who are out there somewhere are always just over the horizon, right? So they're beyond the Euphrates for the people for whom beyond the Euphrates is out of mind, right? It's out of sight. We don't know where they are exactly, but they're somewhere over there. And then, right. Yeah. And so when you get to people who are, say in that region, well, they're over, they're further out there somewhere. And this is what you get is that there's this sort of pushing of the horizon where they're out there. We know they're out there. They have to be out there because the prophets promised that they would be restored, and they can't be restored if they don't exist.
Right.
And this seems to be the issue. So you get something like the book of Tobit, which is, to me, one of the most fascinating pieces of early Jewish literature, in that it follows a Naphthalite who is identified as a faithful Naphthalite who actually would, instead of sacrificing in the ways of the northerners and going to the northern shrines, would actually travel down to Jerusalem to sacrifice in Jerusalem, because he knew that that was the right way to do things. You know exactly who the authors of this are then, right? I mean, this is coming from a southern perspective, but this tells this story. It's a novella. It's a little novel that tells the story of this Naphthalite, and the tribe of Naphtali was the first tribe to be taken into exile according to 2 Kings. So, you know, they're taken by Tiglath-Pileser as a part of his campaign, and he's among the first people taken, but he's a faithful Naphthalite, right? And that matters. And the whole story is about God making sure that his children, or that his child and then another Naphthalite's child, find each other so that they can have good progeny. And then they ultimately essentially are guided by one of God's angels to continue going east and to go and wait. And eventually, you know, their descendants are going to come back. And this is the hope at the end of the book, is that, you know, Naphtali isn't lost, right? There's still Naphtalites out there. They're there to be.
They're not allowed to marry other tribes. Like,
right.
Naphtali only can marry, they can't marry Jews.
Well, the thing is, they can, right? Well, but the problem is, if they do, then you don't have Naphtalites to restore anymore. Right. So for the purpose of the book, they're so devout, they're so focused on this, and God is so concerned to make sure that all of Israel will ultimately be regathered as expected, that he makes sure that the Naphtalites that even the first tribe, the ones that nobody knows where they are, that they're out there somewhere. And we know this because when you read the book of Tobit, you see that Tobit and his family were faithful. God provided for them, and he told them, well, Assyria is going to fall soon, so you guys need to go further east, and you'll be taken care of out there. And then just keep going, right? And you know, eventually they're in New Zealand somewhere, right? So this is that idea, but there isn't. You know, there isn't any archaeological evidence. There isn't any textual evidence of people who are actually doing this, who are actually understanding themselves to be the Naphtalites somewhere. I do think that there's probably vestiges in different places where, you know, maybe there was an Israelite community that lasted for a good bit of time, and then it culturally impacted the people that were around it, but eventually they assimilated. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, maybe if you had great evidence and the right, you know, anthropology to do, you could find, like, you know, this may have been an area that was that you can see these various influences that are coming in that may have been Israelite, right? Something like that. But that's as far as we can get. And they marry in. And this, to me, is one of the things that actually becomes, I don't think Paul was necessarily the guy who came up with this solution, but he's the one that argues it most ardently and clearly. Is, I think Paul basically makes the case that when you read the prophets, when you read Amos or when you read Hosea in particular, Hosea says to the northern kingdom, "You are not my people," and Paul goes, "It's been hiding in plain sight all this time, everybody. The Israelites became not my people." Well, who are not my people, folks? That's all the other peoples. Israel became indistinct. There isn't an ethnic separation between the people that Hosea is addressing and the other nations. They became part of those other nations. Well, if God's then going to restore Israel, the not my people that he promises that to in Hosea, then that means he has to bring in, like, really not my people. Like, that means he has to go to people who are actually these are not Israelites. Right. And so for Paul, this ends up being first of all, I think he and the earliest Christians are responding to the question. They start to see people who are uncircumcised men, who are showing, whatever it looks like, the signs of having received the Spirit. that they understand as a part of the new covenant, which is a promise of Israel's restoration. And then you got some serious stuff to explain.
God-fearers and things like this, right?
Yeah, that sort of thing. But men who have their foreskins.
Right.
And if that guy has the spirit that is promised to Israel, and it's only promised to Israel in the prophets, then you have a whole lot of splaining to do, right? You have to figure out, wait a second, you're going back to your text, like, where is this coming from? I don't, like, that guy still has his foreskin, and I know he still has his foreskin, and I'm not sure where this is coming from, but we got to figure out what's going on here and how this actually relates to the prophecy, because this is supposed to be for Israel.
Right.
And so then the explanation, there are a few different possibilities. One explanation is you can say, well, this is how God is restoring Israel, and now they need to be circumcised. And this becomes the argument. This is why you would need to circumcise somebody. You don't circumcise somebody in this context, unless you actually think they're becoming a part of Israel. But Paul argues, no, we're not understanding something here. God said that he would restore Israel and Judah. And if we circumcise them and they effectively become Jews, then this is really only saving Judah. But this is God's way of bringing in the rest of Israel, because the rest of Israel intermarried with all of these other people. And so the only way to bring in the rest of Israel is to bring in everybody, to bring in, to open the doors to all of the rest. And so I don't think he is imagining that these are actually, that every person who receives the Spirit is a lineal descendant of an Israelite somewhere. Because all that's necessary here is that he's making the connection between Israel became not my people, and now not my people are being saved. Well, that opens the door to all not my people.
Right. And this is the heart. This is why when I wrote you and said, hey, okay, so there seems to be universal ta ethne, if you will, the nations, plural, other than Israel. There seems to be implications of promises in Jeremiah or Isaiah that sound like something that's the light will go to the nations, like bigger than just Israelites. And then there's some places that sound like Israelites will be scattered among the nations. So there's this group I deal with that conflates them to make them one and the same. And when they do so, they're trying to still keep it ethnic. And one of the things I think is interesting too, as I read through Second Temple Judaism's material and Dead Sea Scrolls, is how non-liking these Jews are towards the Gentiles. Yet Paul comes on the scene doing like the homilies and other texts that are very pro-Gentile over against that are like anti-Gentile. There's like seemingly two different crowds. One can't wait for the rod to come and destroy the nations. The other side is saying, look, there's something that can be good of this. And you're saying Paul seems to be more of a cosmopolitan type of Jew who's in Rome on the ground, seeing God-fearers and saying, all right, I'm a biblical minded Jew. I'm looking at the text and I see this must be a fulfillment of the end. This is something that's actually happening here. He's restoring Israel, but also, do you think he's also simultaneously fulfilling prophecies that the nations would see when the restoration of Israel would come in? It seemed like Israel would rule the world and the nations would come to Mount Zion, saying, teach us the truth. Is this what's going on?
So, yeah, I think the thing that is really interesting about what he does is he does, I think, kind of combine the two aspects. So I think he understands the blessing of the nation. So you've got in Galatians 3, right? Galatians 3, 12, 13, 14, he says, that Christ died, freed us from the curse of the law, so that you've got this hina clause, this so that clause, where he says, so that the nations would receive the blessing of Abraham, or the nations would be included in the blessing of Abraham. Or actually says a better translation of that would be, so that the nations might the blessing of Abraham might come to the nations. That's a better translation of that. And then then he has the second hina, which assumes the first one, where he says, and there's no and, so that the blessing of the nations might come to the nations, so that we might receive the promise, or the spirit of promise. And he puts those two things together. The spirit of promise is promised to Israel, and then of course you have the nations that are promised to, Israel's supposed to bring about justice to the nations and all of these things. And he understands this as the promise to the nations is actually fulfilled through the promise to Israel, and the promise to Israel is fulfilled through the incorporation of the nations in the promise to Israel. So the whole thing kind of ends up being, it's a way for God to kind of elegantly tie it all together with one move that was unexpected. All the while, you still have a distinction between there are Jews and Gentiles who still are circumcised and uncircumcised within the church, and they have to learn to live together. And he sees both of those working together as all one move, so that the promises to the nations and the promises to Israel are all fulfilled in the same movement, in the same thing, and that is through the gift of the Spirit that enables people. And this is where I think Paul might be the single place where Paul is most misunderstood. Paul is fundamentally focused on ethics and focused on how people live and whether or not people are obeying God. Now, what that means for him is an interesting thing, but his whole argument is that God has given the Spirit to Jews and Gentiles who follow Jesus in order to make them obedient, in order to make them agents of justice in the world, who love their neighbor and who love one another and who bring justice to the world. And this is what it's all about, because the prophets promise, he says, that, Israel's going to be restored. And in order for Israel's restoration to be lasting, Israel's going to have to receive a new heart and a new spirit, because the reason that Israel wound up in the situation that it's in to begin with is because they didn't obey. They couldn't obey. And so that needs to be fixed. And Paul understands his whole thing as fixing that. And that's a problem that Israel has. That's a problem that Gentiles have, is each one ends up having this sin problem that the Torah can't fix, but the Spirit can for him. And so it's supposed to make people into people who become agents of justice in the world.
It's fascinating.
And it's all tied to this whole idea that is Israel and Judah have to be reunited, have to be restored, and have to be given a new heart and a new spirit, which is all part of the prophetic stuff that we see in the Hebrew Bible.
So I hear the children.
Yeah,
it's okay. I have kids too. But in this passage that I was pulling up here in Galatians 3, something maybe we don't have to read through it, of course, because you've read it a million times. I've read it a million times. It sounds like Paul's doing a different argument in the book of James. His argument seems to be prior to the actual circumcision that occurs. God made a promise to him. He made a promise to him, and this promise seems to be why he's not requiring and demanding circumcision on his Gentile audience. And he also makes this strange, I like to use spiritual language. Groups that I'm encountering, they don't really care for the word spiritual Israelite or
pneumatic is fine.
Yeah, I just say, look, in Christ is the seed of Abraham. Singular. He literally is trying to say that on purpose. He says not plural, like singular. Okay, what does this mean? That means having faith in Jesus makes you in Christ, which is a child of Abraham, in a sense, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think so. This is where I think the work of Matt Thiessen is really helpful. I really like his metaphor of Paul understands the people who receive the Spirit, the pneuma. He understands this as what we today might regard as like a DNA transplant, right? So they actually are transformed into the family of Jesus. And of course, Jesus is the one to whom the promise was made. So for Paul, the interesting thing is that these men, and you see this at the end of Romans chapter 2, where he says that the uncircumcised or the foreskinned man, he actually uses metonymy, where he says, if the foreskin, so if foreskin does the law, well, okay, that's interesting. But no, if foreskinned man does the Torah, fulfills the righteous, or keeps the righteous statutes of the Torah, then will not his foreskin be counted as circumcision? This is the argument that he makes, and I think where Thiessen's argument here is helpful is I think Paul understands that these people who are obedient through the Spirit, through the pneuma that has been, it's Christ's pneuma, it's a part of Christ, that they actually become a part of the body of Christ. When they become incorporated into Christ, they actually become basically they are DNA transplanted, such that they actually are circumcised. They're not circumcised in the flesh, but it's not the flesh that matters. It's Jesus' body that matters, and Jesus' body is circumcised, and it's Jesus' obedience that works itself out in them through the pneuma. And so I think that's basically what he does, is he understands this that way, which is why you don't need to be circumcised in the flesh, because if having received the pneuma and getting the DNA transplant that says that I'm in fact circumcised because I'm in Christ's circumcision, and now I need to go ahead and actually make it real by circumcising my flesh, now I'm acting as though that's not a real thing.
That's exactly how he argues too. That's a great point. Like, why is he saying that in Galatians? And then he's saying, just cut the whole thing. He gets so mad. He's like, cut your thing off. And I don't blame him in his mind. Now that I see what he's trying to say, that makes a lot of sense. Can I hit you with a few different, like, how would you answer certain?
Sure. You know, one last thing before we move into this is I actually think that it's worth pointing out that the Epistle of James does not actually mention circumcision. Right. So where you have any distinction or any potential debate between, say, Galatians or Romans and James, it's fascinating that James says nothing about circumcision. Right. That, I think, is often overlooked because James is so focused on you have to do these works. Well, read Galatians 5. Read Galatians 6. Paul's obsessed with this idea that if you have the Spirit, you're going to do these works. And if you don't do these works, then guess what? You're going to get what you deserve. And you get the same thing in Romans 2. You know, both James and Romans 2 say it is not the hearer of the law that is just before God, but the doer of the law, right? Each in slightly different wording, but the same concept. So it's worth noting that they're probably, you know, in discourse, in dialogue between the two of them, James and the Epistle of James and what we see in the Pauline epistles. But what we don't see in James is an argument that Gentiles need to be circumcised, and I think that's a worthwhile distinction to make. But go ahead with your rapid fire.
Well, it's not even rapid fire. It's almost like, you know, you pick a verse in the New Testament that sounds very ethnic focused, because all you got to do is quote the Old Testament passage and find out real quick, oh, that's ethnically related. Hosea 1, you know, running to these passages, Jeremiah 31. And I mentioned Hebrews 8:8. The first thing to ask is, who is this author? We know it's not Paul. At least we don't think it's Paul. Okay, the church is probably
it's not Paul.
Okay, because Paul was known to say, "I, Paul." But
yeah, well, not just that, but the Greek is very. I mean, if this was Paul, it was Paul writing. Paul written by someone other than Paul, because this does not read like the Greek of any other book in the New Testament.
You said the new covenant's meant for the house of Israel and the house of Judah. So when someone goes straight to that, and now mind you, the people you're probably dealing with, Dr. Staples, are usually on the 99% side, which means they're coming from replacement theology, the 4 different views you mentioned in your article on Romans 11:25. So they're usually coming from one of those positions. This is probably the weirdest initial episode you're going to do, because it's actually the guys who come over and say, I believe everything you just said, but I go further and say the Gentiles are actual Israelites. And then when you pin them down and you show that, well, in real history, we have no reason to think these were really Israelites, they'll run to fiction. So now they want to say Paul's epistles are epistolary fiction, and they want to suggest it's a fairy tale story. It's like a Cinderella story. This is how they look at Paul, and I'm going, there's too much here to say this isn't a real guy. I can't ignore the evidence. So they want to say that. I don't want to straw man or poison the well, but I want you to know that so that you can understand where they go to. Hebrews 8:8, house of Israel, house of Judah. How can you say these Gentiles, pagans, non-Israelites are part of the new covenant? They can't be. They run Ephesians chapter 2. I'm going to hit fire and let you just address these. The dividing wall. Don't you know the dividing wall was between Israel and Judah? But, you know, in the second century, we know there's Jew and Gentile distinction, that binary distinction, or the temple has a court to the Gentiles and inner court. But anyway, I'd like for you to address some of this stuff. Ephesians 2, Hebrews 8:8, Romans 9 through 11, Matthew, they go to Matthew 10 and Matthew 15. I came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And that's a big doozy, I think, for them too. If they try to say the Gentiles are literal Israelites, they want to redefine what Gentile means in Matthew chapter 10. But anyway, I'll stop right there. There's some more I can bring up to kind of get your thoughts, like Revelation 7, the 144,000. Why is the tribe of Dan not mentioned there? You know, what's going on, man? There's so much here. So
yeah, there's an awful lot. And so I'm gonna start with a couple things. One is, it's worth noting that in Jeremiah 31:27, you have this mention. It says, days are coming. And remember that the new covenant prophecy is 4 verses later, right? So I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Here you have, days are coming when I will sow the house of Israel and the house of Judah with the seed of humans and the seed of beasts. So in its original context, this is probably, you know, intended to mean that basically people are going to come back and they're going to live in this area that are going to be Israelites and Judahites, and they're going to have livestock and cattle and such as well. But in the apocalyptic world, by the time you get, you know, through Daniel and all of these other things, when you have the seed of beasts that are mentioned, the beasts, or the various animals, it's a way of referring to the nations. You know, you've got, this is a way of saying with the seed of Israel and Judah, sure, but also there's going to be some others that are going to be a part of Israel and Judah as well. Even in Ezekiel, you have this mention of the ger, the stranger, or the foreign sojourner, is to be incorporated in and given an inheritance just like the rest of Israel. That this is in, I think it's in Ezekiel 40, it's somewhere in there. So you already have a precedent for this, and frankly, you can go all the way back into Exodus, where, you know, there were people from Egypt who are not Israelite who in Exodus it mentions that there's this mixed group of people that comes out of in the Exodus with Israel, and they get incorporated.
That actually deals with 1 Corinthians 10. The one of the problems they say, First Corinthians 10:2, he's addressing his audience in Corinth, these pagans. Derek, you're so wrong. And what is really happening here? And I said, well, don't you remember the mixed multitude that did come out through the Red Sea? So if he was being literal, he could be saying you're foreigners in a sense, but you're also part of the community, which makes you part of. I'm just saying. Well,
I think the big thing here is that he again, over and over again, keeps coming back to the pneuma. And I think, again, understanding that it's the pneuma that changes. So Paul believes that people's ethnicity is changing when they come into Christ. That's the thing. So part of this problem is that a lot of people in the modern world think of race or ethnicity in a different way than people in antiquity did. Right? So there's this idea that, well, obviously, if this is with Israel and Judah, it must be with people who like have the exact DNA as a result of, you know, their genealogy goes back. But that's not exactly how ethnicity has historically worked. And it's certainly not how it worked in those days. You could actually become a different ethnicity. The work of Denise Buell is probably the entry point to that, probably the best entry point to that. She did Why This New Race. It's back in like 2003, somewhere in there. And then Carolyn Johnson Hodge as well. I think it was a 2005 book where she talks about a lot of this stuff as well, where you've got understandings of ethnicity as something that's flexible. It's not something that's rigid. It's not something that is that can't change. And for Paul, I think what he understands, or the way that he understands this, is that by receiving the pneuma of Jesus, who is ethnically, tied in here, when you receive Jesus' seed, or when you receive Jesus' pneuma, you become Abraham's seed because you are now part of Jesus, and Jesus is the seed to whom the promise was made, right?
Yeah.
He's the seed of Abraham. He's the seed of David. So when you come into Jesus and you receive Jesus' pneuma, you become a new ethnicity. The ethnicity, so for Paul, your ethnicity is not fixed in the same way that it is. And I think also this is something that a lot of biblical scholars actually fall into, is making distinctions between terms and categories that the ancient authors don't. So, we tend to think about things in terms of religion versus ethnicity, say, or ethnicity versus culture, or race, and these versus these various things. You already mentioned, and you were right, that in the ancient world, generally speaking, gods were associated with their specific region, but they also were associated with their specific people. Mm-hmm. Right? Paula Fredrickson has put it well that in the ancient Mediterranean, gods ran in the blood. Your god was, gods were ethnic. And what's happening here is that by receiving the pneuma of Jesus, these people are actually becoming the ethnicity of Israel's God. And that's a distinction. And actually in my next book, I've actually got a section in here where and I actually just pulled it up on my own screen here, where I say, look, the language of ethnic or imperial Israel that you have people use all the time presents a problem that seems to have gone unnoticed. Functionally, ethnic or imperial serve as a sort of shorthand to connect Paul's Israel terminology to the presumably less disputed category of Jews, or some aren't necessarily doing that. But here's the problem. Adding ethnic or imperial to Israel does not solve the problem or make things clearer. Right? And I'll give you some examples of this. We like to think of this as, as though it implies a scientifically verifiable or self-evident category. So you can know, okay, this person's ethnically in Israel, this person's not. But okay, what about recent controversies over the decisions of the Israeli government, where there were people who applied for aliyah? This is emigration to Israel on the basis of being Jewish, and they were denied aliyah to people who were self-identified as Jews and had been approved as Jews by Jewish groups in the diaspora. So they apply, and Israel looks at their application and says, yeah, you're not Jewish. And it's like, but my family's been Jewish for 3 generations at least. What's the deal? And they go, yeah, you don't count.
Wow.
Are they Jewish or are they not? Ethnically.
I mean,
good luck.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? I mean, the question is who's making that determination? And beyond that, you wind up with, and being a part of an ethnos has, in the ancient world, always meant association with various cultural and cultic practices and all sorts of other things. So that, basically you have this whole notion of elastic boundaries. If you marry into a Jewish family, you let's say you are a Gentile God-fearer, and then you happen, a pretty Jewish girl over there happens to catch your eye. You decide to get circumcised as an adult and marry into the Jewish community. Are you ethnically Jewish?
At that point, from biblical standpoint, yeah, I would say. I mean, but then again,
there are some ethnic essentialists, among whom might be, say, the author of Jubilees, who would say you're not really
right
necessarily right. There are some, but that doesn't seem to have been the default. The default was, yeah, you're in. But either way, the next question is, is your child in? When you have a son, and now, okay, dad may have been an adult circumcised person initially from another nation, but has a son from a Jewish mother. They circumcise that son on the 8th day. Is that son ethnically Jewish?
Good question.
And so these things get really complicated on the margins. And I think Paul cuts through that. And he says, at the end of the day, if you are ethnically Jewish, if you are circumcised, you are naturally Jewish, you're born, a Jew to Jewish parents, you you know, adopted you agree with the Torah, you adopted the Torah, so you know, bar mitzvah, to use an anachronistic terminology there, or ritual there, but you've become a son of the covenant, and you don't follow Jesus. Are you ethnically in? I think
according to Paul,
I think according to Paul, his answer is no. If you read the end of Romans 2, he says, look, if you are circumcised, and you know, he's already gone through birth and having the Torah previously in that chapter. If you are circumcised and you don't fulfill the law, then your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. You're out. And then he makes it clear later on in Romans that the way to fulfill the law is through following Jesus and receiving the Spirit.
And you said in your article, he also says the natural branches, which is referring to the Jews. This isn't talking about anyone but the Jews, and he counts himself as one. He's saying, look, they could be grafted back in. It's not like God forgot them, but they have to take action on their own part to participate. And
they have to be faithful by following Jesus and by receiving the Spirit. And so for him, the ethnic determiner, the thing that makes you ethnically Israelite, and see, this is
you there?
Lost you there for a second.
You're good. Now go ahead. What makes you an ethnic Israelite?
What makes you an ethnic Israelite, it is tied to his conception of the promises to the Israelite ancestors. What makes you an ethnic Israelite is actually having the pneuma that comes from Jesus. And so this is an ethnic thing for him.
So this is an important point, and I'm glad you did what you did when going to answer those topical Hebrews 8:8, Ephesians 2, Revelation 7, Revelation 14. We go to John chapter 7, which isn't one of those like heavy hitter ones, but where it's talking about the diaspora. Where will you go to teach the Greeks? You know, and you say this is really ambiguous. It might be written that way on purpose. I'd like to address this before we get into Samaritans in the New Testament, just briefly, because it seems like if what you're describing is the case, it makes the most sense to me of why we have replacement theology. To me, that's I got you. But yeah, that makes the most sense for why replacement theology becomes the next step. So you have pagans entering this world, and I use the term pagan to just refer to anyone who's not an Israelite, not a Jew, not a Samaritan, but just a pagan. They join this world, and here now it becomes so popular, and all this ethnic language that is attached to national Israel or Old Testament, you know, northern, southern Judah, is now being applied to people who aren't actually, if you will, a genealogical tie-in to Jews, or in some sense claiming to actually be northern Israelites, but they're now saying they're elect. So here you have like Clement writing to the church in Corinth, the same church that Paul's writing to, saying he was elect. I mean, it makes sense why they would hijack it, or why they use the same language. Because
again, I don't think that's hijacking at that point. What's happened is that the composition of the group has changed. But Paul and the earliest Christians understand what they're doing as completely in keeping with the promises to Israel. And when they refer to churches, what gets translated as churches, as ecclesia, when they refer to the ecclesia, or the church of God, this is language that we see all through Jewish literature, referring to the assembly of Israel, or the assembly of God, the assembly, the eschatological assembly, the group that God is going to pull together and restore at the end. They're understanding this as that. It just so happens, and I don't think Paul anticipated that it would work this way. I don't think any of the earliest Christians exactly anticipated which direction it would go here. But it just so happens that it became so Gentile dominated that then you have it becomes something that, you know, becomes a different thing. But they're understanding this as, you know, when you're becoming a part of the ecclesia, they're not imagining that you're part of the Gentile church, as, you know, over and opposed to the Jews. Right. They understand this as this is the assembly of Israel. And then, of course, I think it is a natural development as the composition of the group changes that they retain that self-understanding. And now there aren't all that many Jews in the group. And so, and you still have other Jewish groups that don't hold to this. And now you've got, a variety of intergroup disagreements about this. And it's, in that respect, it's very little different from, say, the distinction between the Samaritans and the Jews that you have in the first century.
Okay, so the end is near right now. This episode's end is near. I'm letting you go. We're going to do this again, but I just hip firing. How do you answer Ephesians 2, the dividing wall? What is the explanation there from your angle? It seems self-evident based on what you said, but maybe the horse's mouth might be best to actually say it.
That's a little too much to answer rapid fire, to be honest. I think the big thing there is he's dealing with the division between Jews and Gentiles, and specifically that the Torah lays out that distinction, and basically what happens within Christ, or within the Messiah for him, is that as people come into the Messiah, the distinctions that are made between those who are outside the covenant and those who are inside the covenant by nature get erased, because you're both inside the one with whom the promise of the covenant was made. So,
Simple.
But that's more of a question for after the second book, to be honest.
Okay, I will save that one. 144,000 Revelation.
So you're asking, why is Dan not there?
Well, no, that was just my little, I dropped that, but it sounds like the redemption song is only for the 144,000. There's a great multitude after that. Seems to be the same group. A lot of scholars say it's the same group. Some people want to argue, no, they're two separate groups. You have the nations, every tribe, kindred, nation, tongue, and then you have the 144,000, which is Israel. How would you explain that? Because they're arguing, these people often are arguing it's only about same thing. It's self-evident.
I think the best explanation of what's going on there, I mean, if you're reading this from an early Jewish perspective, which I think, again, Revelation is an early Jewish text, is that you're dealing with 12 times 12 times 1,000. And when you get that kind of number play, you're dealing with, I mean, Revelation is a highly symbolic book, and you're dealing with a symbolic explanation of who these people are. And I think what you're dealing with is the fullness of Israel, as it were. But again, I think certainly Paul, and it's harder to argue. I think you have a different argument, and you'd have to deal with some other things when you're dealing with Revelation. If Revelation agrees with Paul, then that all Israel includes people from every tribe, tongue, nation, and so on, because it has to. Now, the thing that's really interesting about what's going on in Revelation is that it has the 12 tribes. And we know that in the first century, you don't have all 12 tribes running around identifying themselves as various tribes. At most you have like 5, maybe 4. Depends on how you handle the Samaritans, and whether they identify themselves as specifically from Manasseh or Ephraim, or are they just identifying themselves with Joseph? Which, by the way, you notice that the tribe of Joseph is actually in the 144,000 rather than separately. But then you have Manasseh in place of Dan. Manasseh means forgotten, so it's another thing. But what you don't have is people identifying from Naphtali or from Asher or Reuben or wherever. You've got the one mention of Simeon in Luke, but that seems to be pretty aberrant. So you don't have a whole lot other than that. You've got Judah, Benjamin, and Levi get pretty much everything else. Maybe Luke is evidence that there's some folks from Simeon still running around, but that would be our only data point for that. And then you got the Samaritans. Yeah. Where are all the other tribes coming from? And so, Revelation is still having to deal with the same issues as any Jewish apocalyptic text. And that's really the thing that this first book is dealing with, is looking at how that problem of who is Israel is addressed by different groups within different texts and across, the Second Temple period, basically from 600 on. It's looking at how this issue is dealt with and how this issue is formative throughout that period to explain what different groups are doing and how they're understanding themselves and how they're defining their culture and their boundaries and everything else, as all of them are looking back to biblical Israel as a way to define themselves. And I think that's basically what we're trying to do.
James 1:1, 1 Peter, they do the same thing. I think it goes in the same vein of what you're saying. So you really don't even have to address it. When he's saying to the scattered tribes, he's speaking to those in Christ, period. Right?
I think that's right for James. Yeah. And I'm inclined to think, actually partly on that basis, that the Epistle of James is earlier than most biblical scholars actually put it, because I think James is understanding the people who are coming into Christ as the restoration, or as restoring scattered Israel, and that first opening address is interesting evidence of that. And you see the same thing in a couple other places, but you don't see that language much after you get out of the first century.
And you say First Peter's doing it for sure.
I think First Peter's probably doing the same thing. Yeah, I think it's a little bit less obvious than than the tribal language that you have at the beginning of James, but I think it's also going on in First Peter. Yeah.
Excellent. Last thing, Matthew 10. What the heck's going on? Only go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, but no to the Samaritans and no to the Gentiles. Is he just a different kind of Jew, you think, that's kind of got a different take on this?
No, I think that again, this is part of Matthew's whole program. Matthew has some specific has a specific way of handling Jesus' ministry during his lifetime, and then you see that what happens as soon as Jesus is resurrected. What does he tell everybody to do? Okay, now go to the Samaritans, and now go to the ends of the earth and everything else. So there seems to be, he's sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, but we only really get to see who that includes after the resurrection. And I think that's part of Matthew's sort of narrative frame here. Is he's explaining what's going on with Jesus, who forbids his disciples to do that work prior to, and I think part of what's going on is it's prior to Jesus' death, which means that it's prior to Matthew's notion of the giving of the Spirit, which you don't have quite the same emphasis on. But I think Matthew probably holds similar to that as what we see in other early Christian literature. That once Jesus has died and you have the giving of the Spirit that's available, now those other groups can be brought in, because they can actually, their ethnicity can change, right? The pneuma changes them in ways that it's not really available prior to that in the same way, because Jesus hasn't been glorified. So I think that's all part of what's going on in the New Testament. But the funny thing is, we've talked a lot about the New Testament in this talk, but the first book, the book that we're ostensibly talking about,
right?
The first book sets a lot of foundation for this. It's true, but I mean, in that book, I spend what would you say? 5 paragraphs or something like that on the New Testament.
Barely. Look, what got my attention mainly, Dr. Staples, was the fact that you wrote that article. Oh, wrong one right here. So you wrote that article, and that article drew my attention. So I said, well, I took the journey with you. This book is a must read. It takes you back into the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. It tells you about the patriarchs. It explains what Josephus. You do more than just stick in the Bible. Sorry, fundamentalist, but he goes he goes outside. He's going to test your boundaries. So I absolutely recommend anyone and everyone to go get this book. It is down there in the description. All you got to do is click MythVision recommended books. I read it. It took me 4 days, not because I sat there all day reading it, but I absorbed it. And then I was like, okay, that's a lot to chew on. He deals with anti-Semitic scholarship on insider, outsider language. I mean, you can't, there's not a single thing he didn't really make a point on to try and prove his point. And he had to delve into various fields. It's super complex. So there's a lot of different skill sets that are required to master in those particular fields. And that's what scholarship does. They point in specific things. So I ask everybody, please go down in the description, get his book. Let's do this again, Dr. Staples. I really, there's probably more material I could bring up, and we could do hip fire stuff. If the audience likes this will be on the Patreon, you guys. Join the Patreon. Go to jasonstaples.com. And he's going to have a podcast coming out soon. You're going to want to check it out. So thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And never forget, in case you want a new identity, you can always join us here. We are MythVision.